From the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University.
Well, hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University here on Medscape Cardiology and the Heart.org. Mike Gibson and I have been having a series of conversations over the last few years about what's happened in cardiovascular medicine over the prior year, and it's been a lot of fun to have that conversation. We've already done part one of our 2019 reflection, where we're going to cover some more trials and then get into some broader societal issues, focusing on the 2020 healthcare debates in the election. My guest is Mike Gibson from Beth Israel Deaconess, where he's an interventional cardiologist, the Harvard Medical School, where he's a professor of medicine, and the Baim Institute, where he is the director. Mike, thanks for joining me on Medscape Cardiology.
Thanks for having me back.
First, what I think I found to be one of the most exciting and interesting and potentially really game-changing clinical trials of 2019, DAPA-HF presented at ESC 2019, and then follow-up and big secondary analysis at HA19. Your views on DAPA, were you as excited as I was?
I was astonished. I was very excited to see the data. In the build-up to this, there were several other drugs in the class, in the EMPA-REG trial and the CANVAS trials. These drugs showed reductions in cardiovascular events like cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke, and they also showed some improvements in the secondary outcome of heart failure hospitalization. So this didn't come out of nowhere. And for this agent, DAPA in particular, there was a previous study. There was a reduction in the DECLARE study, not in MACE, but a reduction in cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization. So there was some data there to suggest this might be an effective approach. Those studies weren't really powered to look at the patient who had heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. And they weren't powered to look at those patients with and without diabetes. So the DAPA investigators randomized a large number of people, over 4,700, who did have an EF less than 40% and who had New York Heart Association heart failure classes 2 to 4 in a double-blind fashion over to DAPA or placebo on top of standard of care. And this was type 2 diabetes in the study if you had diabetes. Type 1 diabetics were excluded. You didn't have to have diabetes to get into the study. The study lasted about 18 months. And the primary outcome was cardiovascular death or heart failure. It was reduced from 21.2% down to 16.3%. You would only need to treat about 20 people to prevent one of these outcomes. And cardiovascular death was reduced from 11.5% down to 9.6%. You'd only need to treat about 50 people to prevent a cardiovascular death. And everything else was improved. Fewer hospitalizations, fewer urgent visits for heart failure, fewer heart failure hospitalizations, and better changes in the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire. So the benefit was seen across all subgroups, importantly in both diabetics and non-diabetics. So you don't have to have diabetes to get a benefit here if you're a heart failure patient. I should also say death from any cause was reduced by 2.3%, an amazing improvement in this modern era. Now, we don't know why this worked. We don't know the true mechanism of benefit here. It's been hypothesized to be due to a reduction in preload or some kind of natriuresis or osmotic diuresis or what's called a smart diuretic. Could be also a reduction, obviously, in afterload. Or is the drug improving energetics or cardiac metabolism? Is it somehow improving the sodium-hydrogen exchange? Is it improving fibrosis in the heart or necrosis? And there's all these cytokines that are being upregulated, downregulated. The adipose tissue around the heart might change. Important to note, most of these people had class 2 heart failure. not 3 or 4. And here's one of the other sticking points. Only about 10% of people were on Entresto, but the benefit was similar in those people on and off Entresto. So an amazing result, a single trial though. What do you think, Bob?
I'll try to stress just a couple of things. First off, as you've said, this grew out, the whole series of trials grew out of FDA guidance a number of years ago now that said you needed to rule out cardiovascular harm with these new hypoglycemic drugs. And so there's been a series of clinical trials that have been largely designed to be non-inferiority on the cardiovascular outcomes while you improve glucose control. Well, that by itself has been interesting, but then these observations started to be made with the SGLT2 inhibitors that perhaps they were improving cardiovascular outcomes. So a lot of interest in pursuing that, and I love the design of DAPA heart failure because, as you said, Mike, we have a diabetes drug that's being used in people without diabetes, and it improved their outcome. That's, to me, really interesting and a really creative approach to the clinical trial to include both the diabetics and the non-diabetics in it. I think that the mechanistic work still has to follow. A lot of interesting science to unravel here. These are big effects, and aside from the ARNI issue, which you mentioned, these patients were well treated. I think that this is the hottest trial of 2019 with really important implications for clinical practice. So what did you say at ESC, Mike? Cardiology's back?
Cardiology's back. I mean, it was exciting in the 90s. We had a lull here. We didn't have as many shots on target, but boy, what a year. We've had a lot of great strategies assessed and a lot of great pharmacotherapy and a lot of great interventions assessed. It's been a great year, but this was at the top of the heap.
I agree with you. Now, Mike, let's move to a study, not a clinical trial, but a study coming out of Stanford. I'm not involved with the study, but many of my colleagues were, the Apple Heart Study, which really looked at scale, could you get people to enroll in a virtual study, meaning completely over the phone, and then to ask them to allow you to collect data from their sensor on their watch to try to detect if there's atrial fibrillation. Over 400,000 subjects enrolled over 8 months, which I find the most interesting part of the study, to get such a huge sample, be able to, at a low frequency, potentially detect atrial fibrillation. What to do with that atrial fibrillation, I think, is some studies you're involved with going forward. But to me, again, interesting study, not a definitive study, but one really raising the game for what technology might be able to do in clinical research. That, to me, was the potential game changer here, a real different way of thinking how we collect data at scale. Mike, your view of the Apple Heart Study?
There's two things here, as you alluded to. There's the practical question of what does it do and what did it detect? But the more important overarching consideration is this platform for conducting trials. I'm very excited about this. The idea that you can enroll 400,000 patients in 8 months is just mind-blowing. Important to remember, this was the earlier generation of the Apple Watch. It's not an EKG version. It's one that detected your heart rate from a fancy word, photoplethysmography, using light to look at pulses in the skin. If it was irregular on 5 to 6 measurements, you got prompted to have a telemedicine visit, and then you wore a patch. The watch had about a positive predictive value of about 80%. The issue there, though, is that the patch, as the true standard, was put on a week later, so it might perform better than that. And Bob, as you know, pre-test probability is really critical here. If you're at low risk of having new onset AFib, well, not a lot of it's going to happen. If you were under 40, only 0.16% of the population had new AFib, so that's not many patients. But if you're over 65 years of age, that number rose to 3.2%. So there were legitimate concerns, and there are legitimate concerns about the number of false positives with these kinds of technologies. Would this trigger unnecessary tests, excess resource utilization? We are now building upon your team's experience, and we're doing not an observational study, but a randomized trial. To take this a step further, we're using the newer watch, which has an EKG built into it, a single lead EKG. If you get alarmed that you have an irregular pulse, it'll tell you you need to check your EKG. You'll put your fingers on the bevel, get that EKG, it'll go onto your smartphone, and then you can give that to your healthcare professional. So by actually getting an EKG, we may actually be able to improve the diagnostic accuracy of detecting AFib. So can we detect it? That will be one of the questions. But as you said, Bob, the more important issue is, does it pass the ho-hum test? Can we improve patient outcomes? And we are going to randomize 180,000 people to see if detection and subsequent treatment, whatever the doctor wants to do, if that improves the risk of all-cause death or stroke. And we're looking at the over 65 crowd. We are doing all this virtually. You'll get randomized over the app. You'll be followed on the app. Your outcomes will be assessed by a claims database. So we're cutting out all the bricks and mortar. Bob, what kind of cost savings do you think this will have?
That, to me, Mike, is the exciting thing, is using technology to facilitate what we need to do in the research world. And one of the things we need to do is to have large populations, to do things at scale, to do them more efficiently, to do them less expensively, and to do them in a way that's engaging for the subject to really want to participate in the research process. In Apple Heart, we saw that over 24,000 of the subjects were over the age of 65. So age is not going to be a barrier.
I agree, Bob. And you know the cost of doing randomized trials. At the low end, it's $30,000 per patient. In cancer studies, $150,000 to $200,000 per patient. Cardiovascular trials probably are closer to $50,000. Let's take $30,000. The cost per patient in this kind of study will be $300 per patient. So about 1% of the usual cost of a randomized trial. Now, what we all have to agree to is that the use of claims databases is going to be sufficiently accurate to assess the outcomes. What we are doing is we may be accepting a little bit of noise in using the claims databases, but we're going to overwhelm that noise with, I wouldn't say a mega trial, I would call these giga trials, a giga trial of 180,000 patients. So I think we'll be able to more definitively answer questions rather than just say, well, maybe, maybe not. I think we're going to get definitive answers.
What I like, Mike, is the speed with which we can do it, because if we're going to truly say that we live in a learning healthcare system, we've got to be able to rapidly deploy questions, get the system geared up, answer those questions quickly, and then refine our approaches or refine our questions going forward. This is an exciting time for clinical research and clinical practice to have technology help facilitate that research, which will inform all of what we are doing in practice. So a lot of that to come in 2020.
This is going to improve care for the following reason. We had a lull in cardiovascular development because it was costing $1 billion per trial. Imagine if we can do trials at 1% of the cost. Imagine how many more shots on goal we'll have with newer drugs and devices to try and improve care. I think we'll be able to more rapidly bring newer, more innovative things to patients. I think that's the real promise here.
I agree with that, Mike. This is part of the virtuous cycle of the learning healthcare system, and I am fully on board with what your vision is here. Let's close, Mike, with a little bit commentary on what's going to be going on in the United States over the course of the next 12 months. We have an election coming in 2020. Certainly already in the Democratic debates, front and center has been healthcare reform. We've also seen a series of papers that have revealed the disturbing figures of the statistics that not only has death from cardiovascular disease plateaued over the last couple of years. With regard to certain aspects of cardiovascular disease, including stroke and heart failure, mortality is actually increasing. There's a complexity of reasons that include the social determinants of health, zip code being a big informer of health status as opposed to genetic code. A lot going on, Mike, in 2020. What are you hearing? You certainly, one of your senators is one of the leading candidates for president, and she's put forward some really disruptive notions of how healthcare should be adjusted to not only guarantee people access to care, but fundamentally change our entire system. 2020 is going to be an interesting time.
It is. I live now in Boston. When I was young, I spent a lot of time in a town called Stillwell, Oklahoma. And Stillwell was just in the Washington Post recently because the average life expectancy in Stillwell is 56 years. And it's worse than a lot of parts of the world. A lot of lack of access to care, the big Indian community, lots of diabetes, lots of alcohol, a lot of diabesity. But a lot of these are deaths of despair. When we were at AHA, Rob Califf asked me, how's technology going to improve outcomes? And I said to Rob, I don't know that we're going to technology our way out of this. This morning I wrote on Twitter, I don't think we're going to have drugs to treat deaths due to despair. These are profound societal issues that we've got to wrestle with. Technology and other things can maybe improve access to these more rural areas of the countries where so many people are suffering. But we face enormous challenges ahead. I'm not sure our current system is sustainable at its current speed of growth, and we've got to do something to continue to innovate, but provide more care to more people.
We have a paper coming out in the first quarter of 2020 on health in rural America that will, at a macro level, start to look at some of the issues, as in your hometown in Oklahoma, in rural America. 1 out of every 5 American lives there. It's 60 million people. As a country, we just can't turn our backs on what has become a real challenge in our healthcare system. Technology is going to be part of it. Public policy changes are going to be part of it. And we're going to have to figure out what are the research questions that have to be answered to help improve care in areas of the country where it is death and despair, and make things better. To do less than that would leave us as a very inequitable society, and I don't think any of us in cardiovascular medicine want to see that. So the 2020 election is going to be interesting. There's a lot of excitement with technology, new drugs, et cetera, but some of this, Mike, is going to be paying attention to much more fundamental issues that contribute to healthcare. Maybe that will be the story of 2020, not trials, not technologies, but paying attention to social determinants of health.
I write you in on my forum every 4 years. When are you going to announce your candidacy?
Well, Dr. Gibson, it is always a pleasure to talk with you. We clearly have had some exciting developments in 2019. We got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of opportunity in 2020 and a lot of work to do, but I think that 2019 showed us that we have room for improvement in cardiovascular medicine. We got ways to go, don't we?
We're back. We're back, and we're going to be even more back when we have ways to do these trials less expensively.
Mike, it's been great to have you join me. My guest has been Mike Gibson from Harvard Medical School, Beth Israel Deaconess in Boston, and the BAME Institute. Mike, always fun to talk with you on Medscape Cardiology.
Thanks, Bob.